The funeral was on a Tuesday in November, and I want you to picture the scene clearly because the contrast is important. My wife Sarah was crying quietly in the front row. I was holding her hand. The pastor was saying something beautiful about a woman who had never truly accepted me into her family. And somewhere in that same church, dressed in a dark suit and carrying a leather folder, was a lawyer who already knew something that would change our lives completely. He didn't introduce himself that day. He didn't say a word to us. He just waited. And the next morning, at 8:45, his name appeared on my phone, and everything I thought I understood about the previous 9 years started to come apart. The first time I met Margaret, I brought flowers. Not gas station flowers. I want to be clear about that. I went to an actual florist on my lunch break and spent 20 minutes asking the woman behind the counter what arrangements said. I'm a good person, and I want your daughter's mother to like me. And she put together something with white peonies and eucalyptus that cost me $40 and looked genuinely lovely. I drove to that house with those flowers on the passenger seat, and I was nervous in the way you are nervous when something matters. And when Margaret opened the door, she looked at the flowers, and then at me, and then back at the flowers and said, "How thoughtful," in a tone that managed to sound like a polite version of unnecessary. That was the template for the next 9 years. Sarah and I had met at a mutual friend's birthday party 18 months before that Sunday lunch. And from the first conversation, there was something between us that felt different from anything I had experienced before. Not fireworks exactly, but something steadier and more real than fireworks. The feeling of talking to someone who actually listens and actually means what they say. Within a year, I knew she was the person I wanted to build my life with. Within 2 years, we were living together. Within 3, we were engaged, and I was standing in her parents' living room asking her father David for his blessing, which he gave me immediately and warmly, shaking my hand with both of his and telling me that Sarah had never seemed happier. Margaret sat in the armchair by the window during that conversation and smiled and said she was delighted, and I believed her in that moment because I wanted to, because the alternative was too complicated to sit with. David was one of those people who radiate genuine ease, who make you feel comfortable in a room without doing anything deliberate to achieve it. And from the very beginning, he treated me like I already belonged, asking real questions and listening to the answers, and occasionally pulling me aside at family gatherings to have the kind of honest private conversations that I treasure even now, years after his death. He told me once, about a year after Sarah and I got married, that I was exactly what he had hoped for her, not because I was impressive or successful, but because I was consistent. And he said consistency was the thing that mattered and the thing that was hardest to find. I think about that a lot. Margaret never said anything like that. Margaret said the right things at the right moments. She told me the food was delicious when I cooked. She remembered my birthday without being reminded. She asked about my work with what appeared to be genuine interest. But there was always a layer of glass between us, something I could see through but never get past. And for a long time I convinced myself that I was imagining it. Sarah told me early on that her mother had a complicated childhood, that she was someone who let very few people truly in, and that it took time. And I held on to that explanation for years because it was kinder than the alternative. The alternative being that Margaret had decided, somewhere in those first few months, that I was not the right person for her daughter, and that no amount of peonies or consistency or showing up was going to change that conclusion. The wedding was small, because that was what Sarah wanted, and Margaret sat in the front row in a blue dress and cried during the vows in a way that seemed genuinely moved. And when she hugged me afterward, she held on for a moment longer than usual and said she was so glad Sarah had found someone good. 3 months later, at Christmas, she gave me a cashmere sweater in exactly my size and exactly the gray-green color I would have chosen myself, which meant she had been paying attention in a way she had never let on. And I drove home that evening telling Sarah that I thought we had turned a corner. Sarah squeezed my hand and said she thought so too. By February, we were back to the glass wall. I stopped trying to understand why and started just accepting it as the shape of the relationship, the way you accept a room in a house that never quite gets warm no matter how high you turn the heat. I am going to tell you something that I think is important for understanding everything that comes later, and it is this. I was not a perfect son-in-law. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to tell this story and make myself sound like a man who did everything right and was punished anyway. And while the punishment part is accurate, the everything right part is not. There were stretches of time where I pulled back from Margaret deliberately, where I let Sarah go to Sunday lunch alone because the accumulated weight of being pleasant and warm towards someone who gave me glass in return had gotten too heavy. And in those moments, I probably confirmed whatever reservations she had about me, gave them evidence, handed her something to point to. But I also want to tell you what the other side of those years looked like. When David had a cardiac scare 3 years into our marriage, I took 2 weeks off work without being asked and drove him to every appointment, because Margaret didn't drive and Sarah couldn't take that much time off. And I sat in those waiting rooms reading outdated magazines, and then drove him home and helped him with whatever needed doing around the house, and never mentioned it to anyone afterward because it didn't seem like the kind of thing you mention. David thanked me once, quietly, in the car on the way back from a cardiology appointment, and he said, "You didn't have to do this." And I said I knew, and we didn't talk about it again. When Margaret's boiler broke one January, I drove 40 minutes in the kind of cold that makes your ears hurt to meet the repairman at the house because she couldn't manage the stairs quickly enough to let him in, and I waited 3 hours for him to finish and then drove home and cooked dinner and didn't make it into a story. When her neighbor's dog got into the garden and destroyed the flower bed she had spent 2 summers cultivating, I came over on a Saturday and helped her replant it, which involved 4 hours of kneeling on cold ground while she directed me with the precision of someone who had very specific opinions about where each thing should go. And I did it without complaint because it mattered to her and she mattered to Sarah. None of this made the glass wall thinner. I want to be honest about that too. I did these things not because I expected them to change anything, but because they were the right things to do, and because David was genuinely good to me, and I wanted to be good to his family in return, and because at some point you stop doing things in order to earn something and just do them because that is who you want to be. David died 4 years after the cardiac scare, and it was not sudden. It was the slow decline that is in some ways harder than sudden, the gradual subtraction of a person you love. And when he was gone, the shape of the family changed in ways that were hard to articulate, but immediately felt. Sarah grieved deeply, in her quiet interior way, and I gave her the space she needed and the presence she needed, and tried to read correctly which one was required at any given moment, which is the hardest and most important skill in any long marriage. Margaret grieved in her way, which was with precision and composure and very little outward display. And she aged in those 2 years after David's death in the small, visible ways that grief ages people, a little slower, a little quieter, a little more turned inward. The original will, David's will, split everything equally between Sarah and Claire, with the house going to Margaret for her lifetime, and then divided 50-50 between the daughters. We all knew about it. Nobody disputed it. And it sat in the background of family life the way these things do, present but unexamined. A settled matter. Or so we thought. Sarah got the call on a Wednesday in September, 14 months before Margaret died, and she texted me while I was in a meeting, and I looked at my phone and the message said stage 4, call me when you can, and I excused myself immediately and went into the hallway and called her back, and she was doing that thing she does when she is scared, where her voice becomes very controlled and very precise because the control is the only thing standing between her and falling apart. Not about its current state, but about what it had been when she and David first bought it, 40 years earlier, when it was barely livable and they had no money and fixed it up themselves over 3 summers. And she described specific things: the kitchen tiles they had argued about, the window in the upstairs bedroom that David had fitted badly and that had leaked every winter for a decade before they got it properly sealed, the rose bush along the back fence that her mother had given them as a housewarming gift, and that was still there, older than either of her daughters. She talked for almost 40 minutes, and I mostly listened. And when Sarah called us in for lunch, Margaret stood up slowly and then looked at me for a moment and said, "You've always shown up, haven't you?" Not quite as a question, and then walked inside before I could figure out what to say. I told Sarah about that moment on the drive home, and she cried quietly for a few minutes and said she hoped it meant something. 2 weeks later, Margaret made an appointment with her lawyer and went to his office alone and changed her will. I did not find this out until the morning after the funeral. I have thought about the timing of those 2 weeks many times since then, and I still don't know what to make of it. I probably never will. By October, it was clear that we were no longer measuring in months. The nurse who came 3 times a week became a nurse who came every day, and then there were 2 nurses, and Sarah and Claire started staying overnight in rotation, and the house shifted in atmosphere completely, became something quieter and more serious and more concentrated than it had ever been when I visited it under ordinary circumstances. Margaret in those final weeks was diminished physically, but not mentally. And that precision of hers, that quality of paying close attention and saying exactly what she meant, stayed with her almost to the end. She and Sarah had conversations during that period that Sarah has shared with me in pieces over the months since. Things Margaret had needed to say about her own childhood, and about what she had wanted for her daughters, and about how she felt about the years after David's death. And I am glad they had that time. Genuinely glad. Even knowing what I know now about what Margaret was doing in parallel. She died on a Thursday morning in early November with both her daughters present. And when Sarah called me, I left work and drove to the house, and spent the rest of the day there managing the immediate logistics of death, which are relentless and strange, the phone calls and the forms, and the people who need to be notified and the decisions that can't wait even though everything in you wants them to wait. I cooked dinner that evening for Sarah and Claire's husband at Margaret's kitchen table, something simple with what was in the fridge, and we ate mostly in silence. And I remember the specific quality of that silence. The way it was full rather than empty, full of all the things that had happened in that house over all those years, full of David and the daughters they had raised and the marriage they had built, and now this, the end of it. The funeral was the following Tuesday. I have already told you how that went. What I have not told you yet is what happened the morning after. Gerald Hartley's office was exactly the kind of space that is designed to make you feel that serious and trustworthy things happen there. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that had probably cost more than my first car, framed certificates on the walls in that particular arrangement that says, "I am legitimate and you should not question me." He shook our hands and offered coffee and waited until we were all settled before he picked up the folder in front of him. And I noticed absently that the folder was thicker than I would have expected for a routine estate reading, but I didn't examine that thought, just let it pass. He told us, before he opened the folder, that what he was about to share might come as a surprise. He used exactly those words, might come as a surprise, and I want to pause on that phrase for a moment because it is one of the great understatements I have encountered in my adult life, and I have been thinking about it ever since. Margaret had updated her will on October 14th of the previous year, 6 weeks before she died, 2 weeks after the garden conversation where she told me I had always shown up. The updated will was fully valid, properly signed and witnessed, superseding all previous versions in every respect. He read us the relevant sections in the careful, neutral language of legal documents, and here is what it said. The house, the primary asset of the estate, would pass in its entirety to Claire. Sarah would receive one item, her grandmother's ring, described in the document as being left with love. That phrase, with love, delivered in Gerald Hartley's professional monotone in a room that had gone completely silent, is something I will carry for a long time. Claire said immediately, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she had not known, that she had had no idea, and I looked at her face and believed her without any reservation, because the shock on her face was identical to the shock on ours, and you cannot perform that specific expression. Sarah had not said a word since the lawyer began reading. I put my hand over hers on the armrest, and she didn't move, just sat very still with that particular stillness of hers that I have learned over the years means she is using everything she has to hold herself together, and I sat next to her, and did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say. The lawyer told us there was a personal note attached to the will, which Margaret had instructed be read aloud at this meeting. He looked at us briefly before he read it, and there was something in that look that I interpreted as the closest a professional in his position could come to expressing that he found this part of his job genuinely unpleasant, and then he read it. The note said that Margaret had considered this decision carefully over a long period. It said that throughout her marriage, Sarah had consistently chosen her husband over her family, and that a daughter who forgets her origins and abandons her people does not deserve to inherit what her father spent his life constructing. She did not write my name anywhere in the note. Not once. She wrote her husband, and she wrote him. And she did it consistently, and I sat in that chair and understood that this was not an oversight, that 9 years after I walked into her house with $40 flowers trying to make a good impression, I was still not real enough to her to deserve a name in her final legal document. That landed differently than the house. The house was money and property, and something that could eventually be argued about in court. The name thing was something else entirely. The drive home took 40 minutes, and we spent it in almost complete silence, but not the same silence as the night after Margaret died. This was a different texture entirely, tighter and more charged, the silence of two people who are each separately trying to absorb something too large to absorb quickly. I didn't push Sarah to talk because I know her, and I knew that she was going all the way down to the bottom of this before she would be ready to surface and say anything, and pushing would only make it harder. When we got home, she sat at the kitchen table, and I made tea and sat across from her, and eventually she started talking. And here is what surprised me. She didn't talk about the house. She talked about the note, specifically about the phrase, "forgets where she comes from," and about what it meant that her mother had gone to her grave believing that loving me had been a form of abandonment, that a wife and a daughter were mutually exclusive categories that could not coexist in the same person. She said she had spent years trying to show her mother that those things were not in competition, that loving your husband and loving your family were not opposite forces, and that somewhere in those years her mother had simply decided that they were, and had never revised that decision no matter what evidence was presented. We sat with that for a while. I called our lawyer Patricia the following week and laid out the entire situation, and she was honest with me the way good lawyers are honest, which is to say she told me the truth, and the truth was not entirely what I hoped to hear. Contesting a will is legally possible, but genuinely difficult. The valid grounds are narrow: lack of mental capacity at the time of signing, undue influence from another party, or fraud. And the fact that a decision feels unfair or was emotionally motivated is not, on its own, grounds for anything, because people are legally entitled to distribute their estate however they choose for whatever reasons they choose. Patricia suggested we start by building a picture of Margaret's circumstances in October, specifically around the date she updated the will. We requested medical records, we spoke to her GP, and we had a long conversation with the nurse who had been visiting daily during that period. What the nurse told us, carefully, diplomatically, clearly uncomfortable about sharing it, was that in the weeks before October 14th, Margaret had been having frequent phone calls with a cousin, a woman from her childhood, who had reconnected with her during the illness. This cousin, according to the nurse's measured account, had very firm views about family loyalty, about what it meant when a child chose us, but because what she wanted was what her father had intended for her, and accepting a voluntary arrangement brokered by guilt was a different thing from reclaiming something that had been wrongfully taken, and those two things were different in a way that mattered to her, and she was not willing to flatten that distinction by taking the easier path. Claire nodded and said she understood, and I believe she did. We sat at the table for another 2 hours after that, and for the first time in the entire time I had known Claire we talked honestly, without the management and careful positioning that family relationships usually require. Just three people in a kitchen figuring out how to be decent to each other when decency had not been modeled for them by the situation they were in. It was, strangely, one of the better evenings I have spent in recent memory. The legal case is ongoing. I am not going to pretend it is not draining, because it is, not just financially, though that is real, but in the way that sustained uncertainty drains you. The way that having an unresolved thing sitting in the background of your life prevents you from fully inhabiting the present. Patricia is pursuing the undue influence angle based on what we know about the October phone calls, and she believes we have something to work with, and we are trying to trust that and be patient with a process that is constitutionally indifferent to your desire for it to move faster. What I find myself thinking about, in the odd moments when I have space to think about it, is not the legal outcome but the note. The document where she called me him, because putting my name in it would have made me too real, too much of a person rather than an obstacle, and she apparently needed me to remain an obstacle in order for the rest of it to make sense. I think about the garden conversation in September, the 40 minutes she spent telling me about the rosebush her mother gave her, and the window that leaked for a decade, and I wonder what she was doing in that moment, what she was trying to say or not say, and whether any version of me could have been the person she needed me to be. I don't have an answer to that. I have made a degree of peace with not having one, because some things don't resolve into answers. They just become part of the permanent furniture of a life, things you learn to move around rather than through. What I know without any uncertainty is this: I chose Sarah, and I would choose her again. And the story Margaret told about that choice, that it was a betrayal, a forgetting, an abandonment of something sacred, was a story about her own fears and not about what actually happened. Choosing Sarah was not a subtraction from anything. It was the best decision I have ever made. And I refuse, completely and without apology, to accept a version of the last 9 years that treats it as anything less than that. The man she called him in that document knows exactly who he is. And he is not ashamed of a single thing. If you have been with this story all the way to this moment, I want you to know I genuinely appreciate it, because it is a long one and a complicated one and not the kind of story that wraps up neatly, which I know is not always what people come here for. But I think the complicated ones are sometimes the most honest ones, and honest felt more important than neat when I sat down to write this. I want to hear what you think, and I mean that specifically, not just "that's awful" or "I'm so sorry," though both of those are welcome, but what you actually think about the question underneath all of this. Did Margaret have the right to do what she did? Not legally. We know she had the legal right. But morally, was there a version of her reasoning that makes sense to you? A version where what she did was justified? And if so, what is it? Because I have turned this over from every angle I can find and I cannot get there, but I am aware that I am not a neutral observer, and I am genuinely curious whether anyone reading this can see something I can't. Leave it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to be here for what comes next, because I will update this when there is something to update, and I share stories like this one every week for people who want something real rather than something easy. And if someone in your life is fighting a version of this right now, fighting to be seen in a family that has decided not to see them, share this with them, because sometimes that is the only thing that helps. I will see you in the next one.